He's right there. I think 5.12 is that where you kind of left off?
5.1, 5.12. Yep.
Yep.
We ended at kind of the bearings as we go into bearings and distances and calls to plats and the good stuff.
Well, the bearings is the issue that I would really like to talk about tonight, especially when Wattles talks about changing the uh, basis for bearings in the middle of the description. Um, and I don't say that that never happens, probably does, but I think it's a very rare thing. And he happens to give an example, if you don't mind me taking a little bit of time here.
Go for it. Get
Talk,
us started, James.
Yep.
this example that he lists, he doesn't give us, he has a hypothetical deed that he's reading here, I guess. And he doesn't give us the exact language of it, but he does tell us some important things about this deed. And one of them is that it has a table of bearing and distances that provide a mathematical closure. I think I'm saying that right as to what he said there about this issue. And the
I
other
don't have
thing,
that. I don't have that part highlighted just to turn to it. So I'm trying to read through and remember where that was exactly. Is that
it's close, I think, to the bottom of page 513.
okay? I'm just trying to read
Uh,
through and listen. So I'll leave it on this page here.
um, let's see.
Yep, right here. I just saw it. He talks
Yeah,
about regarding one
Yeah.
single parcel, every bearing may be related. One of the original bearing side for control, there may be changes of bearing control introduced at different points along the traverse.
yeah. That's where he talks about changing the base bearings. And then it's later on, right down at the bottom of the page, he starts talking about this example that he has. And right at the end, it says that he has a mathematical closed traverse, but that course 5 ties to a boundary of an adjoining parcel. I think that's correct. Okay, and so now let's take a look at this, and he gives us a diagram here of the area that he's talking about, and uh, he begins with point of beginning at point number 1. It's an east-sided track, and he supposedly has bearings and distances through points 2, 3, and 4. And if I read him right, I think that he uses the first leg there of 1 to 2 to establish a basis of bearings. And so points 1 through 4 are, in my mind, the location of them is fixed and certain. Once you leave 4, go into 5, and you get into this business about a part of this line of this description being coinciding with the boundary of another track, uh, points 5 to 6, and it's there where I part ways with Wattles, and I say that because there's nothing in this deed or nothing that he tells us about that says that there will be a change in the basis of bearings. And a bearing starts out with either an N or an S. and that has a particular meaning. If it doesn't, then the whole bearing doesn't have any meaning. That letter N stands for north, and it must have a particular meaning, directional meaning. And that should be true throughout the whole of the deed. And it's here that I want to reference a court case. And let's see here what I want to say about a court case on that. In Sir Van B. CSC mortgage, the court says, another canon of contract construction that assists us and is the presumption of consistent usage. That canon embodies the principle that a word or phrase is presumed to bear the same meaning throughout the legal document in which it appears. Now, something close to that language there, you will find in numerous places in numerous court cases. And so here, when he says that because that on the ground, the actual boundary of parcel B does not agree with what the bearing that is contained in the deed. If you use the first basis of bearings, you must now change. And because you found this line on the ground, you must change the basis of bearings in there. And I find that completely contrary to what the courts have said about that being true, the basis of bearings or the meaning of a term to be consistent throughout its usage. So that's one point right there. Then we get into a second point right here. If you take Wattles' description and read it as he carries on, then point 5 becomes point 5, and point 6 becomes point 6N in his diagram. It's shifted off to match the boundary. And then that also shifts point 7 and point 8. They wind up being in completely different locations. And here I want to refer to another case that happens to be one that Wattles himself included, I think, in one of his footnotes earlier in this chapter. And it's Bloom v. McGregor. And there the court said, in order to determine what land was intended to be described, in case of ambiguity, the description may be read by reversing the courses. Okay, so you can reverse the courses on this. You can start at the point of beginning, and instead of going to 2, you can use that basis of bearings and back up to point number 8. And when you do that, you don't go to point 8N, you go to point 8 and then to 7. And they become, their location becomes as certain and fixed as the first 4 points. So now Wattles is telling you that it's 7N and 7-8N are the correct locations, but the court tells you that no, you can back up and have you the location at 8 and 7 as if there was not a change in the basis of bearings. That's number 2. Then number 3 comes along here, and if you read Wattles, the change in basis of bearings completely throws all of the directions for the following courses into disarray. And no longer do you have a description that has a path back to the point of beginning. Wattles shows it as a forced closure with an oddball bearing and distance that appears nowhere in the deed. That's a third contention right there. Now, whenever I see that kind of thing, I stop and I think, as a professional surveyor, maybe I'm not reading this right. Maybe something here is wrong. And there, when I do that, I'm going to talk about a case that I think gives surveyors a pretty good idea about a goal that they should adopt in reading cases. And it's contained in Altman v. Blake, and I'm going to read it. Then, in considering each deed, we begin with a primary rule that the intent of the parties, as expressed in the language they used in the deed, is to be ascertained and given effect. That's a mouthful right there, but it's true. And then he goes on to say, the court goes on to say, thus the intent of the parties must be determined from the 4 corners of the deed. What that means is that it's the entirety of the deed, from one corner to the next, that you must read. And all parts of the deed are to be harmonized and given effect. In other words, you can't just pick one thing over another. All of them have to be harmonized if at all possible. And no part is to be rendered meaningless unless there is an irreconcilable conflict between wherein one part of the deed effectively destroys another part of it. You should avoid that. So now I'm going to back up and I'm going to look at this same kind of deed, because we're going to see this numerous times throughout your career at surveying, where you have a description that has a mathematical closure and coupled with an intent that some part of this boundary has to be coincide with the adjoining tract. It's important. You're going to see this again and again and again. So I start out here by backing up, and instead of looking at the individual horses in this thing, I want to take a look at it from an overall standpoint. And because we want to give a meaning to everything that's in that deed, we want to give each phrase to contribute to what the intent of this deed is. Now, one of the things that in this example Wattles gave us was that we have a mathematical closure with bearings and distances. This table of bearings and distances is descriptive in nature. What I mean by that is that they describe a shape and size of the property being considered. Then he tells us that one part of this tract has to coincide with the boundary of an adjoining tract. Well, now those words are not descriptive in that they don't show direction or distance or whatever within the deed. They show pure intent. And the intent is superior to the bearings and distances. Intent is superior to everything. So let's take a look at that intent. He says it's an intent, and he brings that in as a referral to a boundary. But the intent there is that this grantor is not intending, he's disavowing that he is going to convey any property, any lands that exist on the adjoining tract. He's also making another statement there by that. His other intent is that wherever this tract is, he disavows or disclaims that he is going to retain any property between the tract described and the adjoining parcel. So those two things are things that are intent that's carried by the words that the grantor uses. So you don't necessarily directly compare this intent of one with the table of bearings and distances. They are in fact apples and oranges. So here, one of the things you can look at here and say, well, that intent about not carrying any and not conveying anything of the adjoining tract is a lot like a description of a deed that describes by bearing and distances a certain area, and then says, listen, except, and it gives another description. Well, the listen, except, that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. You have a bearing and distance table that gives you an exact configuration of size and shape to a piece of property. And then he's saying, but I'm not going to defend anything if some of this is across this line on the adjoining tract. It's a disclaimer. And if you think about it like this, what if you had this same deed and you didn't have any referral to the adjoining tract whatsoever? You would go out there, this thing can't possibly convey the property that's on the adjoining tract because the grantor doesn't own it. You can't convey what you don't own, so you just whack that off. It's not to be used anymore. But so you could say that phrase in this case, where it goes across on the other property, is really meaningless. It's surplus. You can eliminate it, but no, you can't. The court has told us that everything must have a meaning. And the meaning here is that this grantor is not going to stand behind his covenant that he is conveying all of this land if any of it is on the adjoiner. And so in that case, it won't ever arise unless at some time in the future, this grantor comes into possession of tract B. He's not going to be faced with a estoppel of a deed where he loses that overlap. That's not going to occur because he included this phrase within his deed. Now let's take the situation of, you will sometimes see this, and the mathematical scheme of things doesn't reach the adjoining parcel. Well, what does that mean? Are you left with a void in there that, are you left in an area where the original grantor keeps some land that is separate from tract A and tract B? Well, no, you don't. Because, when the guy said that what he was describing would go to the adjoining tract, he disclaims retaining any of that. And that's covered. And let's say, let me call up another case here. Let's go to Comier versus Cushman.
And then after that, James, I actually want to pull up an example that talks about what you're talking about. I actually dealt with this today. We can talk about a real world one right now.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, the court has said here, determining what easements rights the parties have in 33A is a matter of intent. It is settled law that the intent of the parties controls the interpretation of deeds. When the language of a deed is susceptible of more than one meaning, the trial court must determine the grantor's intent from contemporaneous circumstances and from standard rules of construction. However, the rules of construction should be applied beginning with the overarching goal of giving effect to the intent of the parties. I'm going to read another case here because that wasn't the one I was thinking about.
Well, while you search for that, let me pull this up and just talk through what I found on one very similar to this.
Okay.
You can search for that other case you were wanting to read here. Let me pull up my AutoCAD.
Also, James, are those the cases that you sent Trent and I that I can throw in a folder?
Okay, I'm seeing something up here.
So when James pulls up that other one he's going to quote, this is a very similar one to the example that's going on here. So you've got a few meets and bounds parcels on the east side of our property. You've got this property right here, and then you have a recorded subdivision on the west side. And the problem with Wattles is we don't see the actual description, right? We don't see the actual calls or bounds that they have. He kind of walks through, hey, here's how it is supposed to be. But this was really interesting. So technically, our deed that we're doing a survey on, which is this center one here, closes, because it comes down, actually matches this line fairly well. And then the deed itself calls to a point on the north line of a road. And so, where that road is up for interpretation based off some survey and everything. But then it goes westerly along that road, or southwesterly, a bearing and distance, which, as you can tell, obviously goes past and into the subdivision. But it calls to the subdivision line, right? It actually gives a bounds there. And the really interesting thing is it gives a bearing and a bearing along it with no distances. And then it just says, and then to the point of beginning, and so it's similar, but a little different in this case is, you've got to take some interpretation in there and say, okay, well, if mathematically it closes, but you're bound by certain calls, you're bound by, calls to a subdivision or calls to a road, and so going back to this Wattles example, I'd be curious to see if we actually had the deed that he pulled this out of, and actually maybe just throw on an aerial image here real fast, just so it kind of makes sense there. But instead of, like James was saying, instead of just rotating everything, you kind of cut off that sliver because they don't have the rights to pray, right? This is what we have, less this right to, we have rights to this one. And so generally speaking, once we tie it to the subdivision, we're going to go out there tomorrow and actually shoot fences and tie it all together. But once you gather all this evidence, it's really interesting how the deed ends up quite well working, right? There's almost no ambiguity. And this is just, again, kind of an aerial image on here, and you can kind of see how it would fit in there. Let me just jump back over to this Wattles one again.
Okay, where Wattles is concerned there, or if you had a situation where the tract that you were dealing with, the deed you were dealing with, described a tract that didn't reach, it fell short of the adjoining tract that it mentions, then we go to McBee v. Nordic Aqua Farms. The intent of the parties is the principal guide to deed construction, and the law reasonably assumes that where a call in a deed runs to the land of another, the grantor intended to convey the entire parcel to that point and not to retain title in a narrow slice of land. So what that means is, had this description, instead of going on to tract B, if it had fell short of tract B, then the surveyor, the deed would contain not only what was included within the bounds of the meets at the bearings and distances, but it would also contain all of that line, all of that property that lies between the two parcels that where the grantor said that they should meet. And this is a little bit more complicated than just whacking it off like whenever it goes across. Here, you've got to adjust the lines to meet the actual boundary that's out there. And you should do so in a way that it mostly could find, would be compatible or harmonious with the intent and the bearings and distances. And there's more than one way to go about doing that. The simplest way is to go to the adjoining tract and find a point that is perpendicular to the line of the adjoining tract that intersects the location indicated by bearings and distances. But that won't work in all situations. You've got to come up with something you can sell to the court there as being harmonious, or bringing harmony to those two functions there.
Yeah, so I try to demonstrate here just on the screen kind of what James is talking about. You know, first we talked about kind of what is written over on the book here, you know, where we've got that red triangle where they've gone to, and Wattles is talking about rotating that whole thing, like changing the basis of bearings. But you know, James and I agree, you know, if the call is to an adjoiner, then you know what they're saying is we're conveying everything we have rights to, less maybe this bad deed that's overlapping into something we don't have rights. And so you would adjust perhaps that one line. And then on the other side of it is just kind of this one I've pulled off to the side. You know, the first one being an overlap, the second one being a gap, just to simplify that discussion is, you know, again, calling to the bounds of an adjoiner, that gap would then be taken if that's what the deed, you know, portrays, and you can support in the evidence that's out there.
That's correct. And that's going to happen in a number of different places. It can happen with a joiner, but it can also happen with monuments. Suppose you have a deed that has bearings and distances that constitute a mathematical closure. Everything looks perfect. But each course, each bearing and distance require or states that it ends in a monument, such as an iron pin with a surveyor's cap on it at every location. Then the meaning of the bearings and distances is that this is where you defines the location where you should find the iron pins. But the pins themselves are the actual boundary. But where you find them is indicated by the bearings and distances. And this way, both of them serve a purpose within the deed. Okay, well, now let's take a look at that very same scenario when one of the places the monument has been lost, pulled up, gone, can't find it. What are you gonna do? Well, with a Wattles type thing, it would back up to the last known line and apply the bearings and distances on that. And you would get a point that is slightly different maybe from what just the bearings and distances gave. And I think that's wrong.
Wow.
I think you should take the bearing and distances, those locations, and then for any missing pin that cannot be found or located, you should set a pin at the place that the bearing and distances indicate, not something that's involves a shift of the basis of bearings. Just shouldn't be done.
Absolutely. I can't think of any description I've ever read where there's that type of shift or any shift would be applied. I think maybe now is a great time to take a quick pause there. And does anyone have any questions about kind of what James has explained, and make sure that rings clear for everybody? Don't everyone jump up at once, guys. You just done a good job of explaining it, James. I mean, throwing in some court cases, made it clear. I appreciate that.
Now, there's one thing I should throw in right here, and that is a disclaimer. Some of the people that are in here have probably or maybe not taken their exams for the surveyor license. And I want to caution you right now, Wattles is an accepted authority on survey. He wrote a book. If you look at the libraries that state Supreme Court cases have for their clerks to review stuff on, you will find a copy of his book. I, on the other hand, am not an authority. I don't have any formal education in surveying.
The School of Hard Knocks, James. The survey Hard Knocks.
I don't have any formal education in law. In fact, I'm an uneducated redneck. So, before you adopt the conclusions that I've come to, you might better do your own study on it. And for goodness sake, when you get to taking these exams, don't go using the things that I'm talking about. You better use the stuff that's the accepted authorities if you want to pass that test.
Okay, thanks, James. Let's keep moving through the book here so we can maybe finish chapter 5 today.
Can I interject here?
Absolutely, Tim.
Okay, he spells out these court cases, and I look at Wattles. The book I have was written in '79. Were these cases after '79? Because I know listening to Walt Robillard in the past and some of these other Don Wilson, and they said, with everything, the courts are changing, and that I'm sure that they're going against some of Wattles stuff because it's quite an old book, and that things have changed. So I mean, they can give you kind of a direction to go to, but when the courts get in there, And the land, these aren't, true land courts, they can just, willy-nilly come out with something and it'd be wrong. And it makes you think about, well, what direction do we go now?
Well, the law does change, but it changes very slowly. It may differ from state to state to some extent, but most of these, what issues or principles that I've talked about tonight, I think that you will find in almost every state, if you look at enough court opinions, you will find something that's very similar to the fact that there may be changes. Occasionally, you see a change because some state adopts a statute. This is quite common with such things as adverse possession. It may require a different time in different states. It may change from one type within the law as the state legislature comes out with a new law. But as far as case law goes, it changes very, very slowly.
I think that's why it's important to be active in like your state societies, right? And maybe acting in a conference committee, and choosing speakers that are familiar with state law and case law. And I've talked about this on here before, but as when I was a young rodman first looking to get into school and licensure and started going to state society, conferences, you'd sit there and you'd listen to these really, really rare cases or really historic cases. And sometimes I'd get a little lost in it. I'm like, well, how does that apply? But, the more I get into it, classes like this and the mentoring Mondays, and even some of the speakers we've had, in our Utah conference, it's really interesting, those that can bring up current cases. So being involved in that, I think speaking to this group here is we tend to be the ones that care about that more because we're here on our own time to do that. But getting people that know that, keeping up with it ourselves as a professional obligation is really important. But to Tim, to your point, absolutely, case law can change the way this is interpreted and used, and the tests are nationwide tests, so they're trying to hit key points and major points, and so there might be minute differences between maybe something that we read here or what we do in the real world practice versus what a test might say. But in any of my review of the test, I think most of those questions are a little bit more high level, that you're not getting into some of those nuances. But I think that's a fair point to make and understand that it does change. The way we've measured changes, so the way we interpret this now changes.
Well, in this particular case, as I say, as you go forward as a professional engineer, you will have this crop up a number of different times. A case where you have a close bearing and distance description and an intent to somehow or another fit with an adjoining parcel or road or whatever. And there's one of four things that can happen in that. One is that the bearing and distances will coincide perfectly with the adjoining property. For number two, the courses and distances will extend wholly onto the adjoining tract, and they have to be clacked off. Third, you have the situation where the bearings and distances don't approach or don't reach the adjoining tract and have to be adjusted. And the fourth instance is where you have a combined line of that is partly short of the adjoining tract and partly goes across the line and partly encroaches on the adjoining tract. Those are the four cases that you will run into. They will be one of the four if you have that fact situation derived in your deed. And I've tried to lay out here some ways to bring that into harmony. What we get on the test and what we get with surveyors who go to a court is people who have studied the surveying masters, those people of authority. But we don't go before. I did a little thing I was thinking the other day, and I wrote a little deal about it, published it. But if we had boundary disputes that were resolved before a professional land surveyor under binding arbitration, boy, things would be a whole lot easier for us as surveyors. We could study surveying, principles of surveying, and know that when we got to that arbitration, that we would look good. But that's not the case. These things are resolved before court. And for every principle of surveying, you will probably find a very similar principle of law. And about 90-something% of the time, it won't make any difference which principle you use, you will arrive at the same conclusion. It won't make any difference. But in the cases where one does not match the other, you better know the law, because a surveying ain't going to get you there. Now, I know a lot of you don't want to practice law. That's a big step. But they call it a legal description. They call it a legal will. Any right that is determinant of a person's rights or obligations is a legal writing. And a person who reads that writing and issues a professional opinion to someone is practicing law. Take out an advertising in a newspaper that you are going, or for a fee, you will read somebody's partly done contract over some issue and tell them what their remaining rights and obligations are in that contract. And I'd almost guarantee you're going to run afoul of the local bar, and the prosecutor are going to be around to see you real quick.
It's the quasi-judicial function of surveyors, right?
When surveyors interpret a deed, it's a legal writing, and your interpretation is no different from the practice of law. It's not practicing law, it's practicing surveying. They just happen to overlap.
Yep. Thank you, James. I agree. I mean, we've talked about that quite a bit. We talked about it when we started boundary evidence and procedures, right? That book starts out that surveyors aren't lawyers, and then here's all the way we act as lawyers or judges, right? Okay.
One of the first things that I did, and this was probably, I'm going to say late in 1973 or early 1974, and the consulting engineering firm that I was working for at the time had just bought a Hewlett-Packard desktop. I don't know what they called it, a calculator or a computer, but it was a computer of the day. And I had been interested in this for some time, and I really needed to know some more about it. And I was at a bookstore that handled technical books and textbooks, things of that sort. And I happened to spy a book, and it said, Survey of the Law of Real Property. And that kind of caught my eye. I went over there and I thumbed my way through that. And I decided I've got to have this book. And later on, I think it was a Westlaw book. And I think it was used as a textbook for a lot of first or second year law students. I didn't know that at the time. I took it home because it had information in there that I needed to know. So it's still there. And if you want to know, it's in the library that the Supreme Courts use too, along with Wattles. But that was a start for me. I read that book and I started to see things that I had seen before. It's still out there. You can still get a copy of it. It's been updated about every 10 years. And if you think that the law has changed, you might want to read one of the later versions of it. But it's a good place to start. And I think that you can find it. There's a site on the internet, what do they call it? Archive.org or whatever. I could get this, I could publish someplace. And they have copies of these books, Wattles and just about every other book. And you can borrow it and read it, the entire book. And you borrow it for an hour, and then you borrow it for another hour and another hour, and another day, as long as you want to. But all these things are still available. Surfers maybe ought to take advantage of that. Some things are so much easier now than they were when I was coming up, because there was no internet. And I don't know how many hours I spent in a law library when I was a law student, but they're public libraries. You can go in them. You can go in the state law library probably and look at everything that they've got.
Well, when I took boundary law from John Stahl, that was one of the classes. We spent a Saturday there at the University of Utah Law Library, and he walked us through that. And Trent threw up the link to your cases that you sent us, and the ones that you talked about today. So there's some more legal research for people to read and some court cases there. And then Levi threw in internetarchive.org for the books. And I think we talked about that a few weeks ago too. We actually pulled some of those up in one of these sessions. So there's some more reading for you guys. Besides Wattles, there's plenty of stuff there to go through. Got about a half hour left here, so let's quickly get through the rest of chapter 5 here. So we talked about bearings, and then the next one we've kind of hit on this, but distances, right? And in what controls distances, depending on when they were measured, could not be as accurate or precise as we can measure today, right? And so when we look at these rules of construction, what is the hierarchy of that? What's the most likely to be correct or follow? Bearings are one of the areas that or distances, are one of those areas that are more likely to have error in them. And we have to regard when the deed was written and how it might have been measured at that time. And then the lowest point of our rules of construction in a description are quantities, right? An area, and because it's just so loose in interpretation, and the bigger the parcel, the more error is possible in a quantity, an area of a description there. I didn't want to spend a ton of time. I know we talked a little bit about boundaries, but any other comments or thoughts about
What?
Okay, I think we just got some.
Oh, yeah.
Aiden, I think
So should I
you're
tell my uncle
talking
he's a
and not
liar?
unmuted there.
Doesn't matter, I'm just saying that they probably.
Okay, the next one I want to get into quite a bit more is kind of what my example was, because it was tied to maps or plats and particular calls, and these are the easier ones to hopefully retrace and survey from. So maps and plats as boundaries, particular calls, streets and highways, and we've had a couple discussions in these classes about streets and highways and how do we survey those? How do we find what a right of way is, particularly in some older streets that may not be as well documented. So I just want to spend the rest of the time we have here kind of touching on these and see if you guys had some experiences or comments on what Wattles talks about as far as plats, maps, boundaries, and highway and street calls. So before we kind of read and hit some of these highlights, again, just give anyone else a chance to kind of speak up and throw what your thoughts are on here. Okay, great. Well, I'll just keep talking. We'll jump into it here. So streets and highways is one that's really kind of interests me, because there's this unique challenge when we get into it. Is there is a road, it's about 1.5 miles from where I live here. It's a DOT road, and as a developer surveyor, I've done, I don't know, 5 or 6 subdivisions along this road. And every time we go to do a development, the city says, okay, you got to do your survey, and then we get the engineers involved, they design the subdivision, and we've got to do a plat that dedicates part of the road and the new roads inside the subdivision. And inevitably what happens is we have to have a conference call and an application with the DOT. And to rag on the DOT just a little bit here is, every time we do this, it's the same conversation as, well, we don't have any maps on this road, so we don't know what our right of way is there. We'll get back to you. And having done 5 or 6 of these now, we have to remind them every time. I'm like, well, we've had this conversation. You don't know what it is, so we're going to dedicate. What width do you want us to dedicate? This is what we dedicated. At this adjacent one. But in retracing a survey, that gets kind of difficult, right? Is if it calls to the right of way, but there is no maps for it in this case. Many of the properties just tie to the section line, right? And so you've got to determine, what was the standard in legislation for a state road at the time that road was created or built, versus what it might be now, or what other calls are. Or, on the other end, you've got a map, which is a DOT map. And sometimes those can be difficult if you're not used to looking at them. They've got stations, and they've got spiral curves, and they've got, whole plethora of information that doesn't even apply. And you kind of have to sift through those maps. And so, sometimes you'll get a deed that calls to a highway, and it says, then to a point at station such and such of a highway map. And so I'll throw it out here to the group, and really going to force your participation this time is, in your states, what is the source you go to pull those maps? Is there a DOT depository that you can go to, a website? What does it look like in where you guys practice to be able to pull and understand what road right-of-ways are?
We've got to request ours through email. They're working
through the DOT.
Yeah, through yeah, they're working on trying to get a GIS system up, but that's years down the road. So
Yep.
Everything's done through email.
It's been a while. It's been a while since I requested anything from the Arkansas Highway Department, but they have strip maps on all of their highways. And if there is an established right of way there, there will be ties to sections and quarter corners and land corners or whatever that they found. And all of this will be tied to their, what they're claiming for their right of way. And it will always be, or most always, be oriented to state plane coordinates, which is very helpful if the surveyors would just get that. But about 9 out of 10 surveys are done by surveyors that don't even know the strip map exists, much less take the time to go and get it. So that's the way things are in Arkansas. Now, there are other places too where they've taken a county road and made it into a state highway, and it hasn't, strip map hasn't been developed. And most of those will tell you that their right of way is by prescriptive easement, or in some cases is of a distance from the center line that was contained in a ordinance that was passed by the county for road acquisition. But that's the story in Arkansas.
In Utah, we have UDOT kind of divisions, and so I work in the area one, which is the northern area of Utah. So there's a source. I've got him on speed dial. I can call him up, and it usually takes a few days, a couple of days to get a map anywhere in ours. And so there's a right of way person that you generally can reach out to. When I was doing some work in Iowa, we generally went to some sort of county roads department, and they held most of the maps, including some of the DOT maps, or you went to the regional area to grab some of those. But every state's a little bit different, but certainly in those ones I did request that. Sometimes you have to go in person and just go copy out the maps. They didn't have anything digitally. When I get stuff for my area, this region one of UDOT, can be frustrating because everyone comes as a different image and not even a PDF. And so then you've got to sit there and kind of stitch some of those together, and it can be challenging to track and trace some of those. Levi threw in here, TxDOT has maps and a website. You can do an in-depth request as well. He says it takes about a week. I don't know we have any of our East Coast guys on today. See if we've got any other experiences with that. Okay. Oh yeah, NJ.dot has Joe, it's SLD, straight line diagrams. You need a reference from the requesting map. So you just kind of requesting, hey, I need it between this station and this station, or this map and this map, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's actually mile markers I use.
Okay.
So I don't get to do it too much. I leave that for the office guys to do. So
I don't blame you. I avoid that when I can too.
yeah.
And railroads are kind of the same way too. If you're requesting that, we talked about how to get some of those. Mentoring Monday's done a few classes, but sometimes there's mile markers on railroads, and knowing some of that information is huge in interpreting and pulling some of that information. And then he kind of ends this here with private ways. The conveyance of parcels of land bounded by private ways generally held to carry to the center line thereof. Even though the granting clause include its use by the grantor, his heirs and assigns, an open private alley has the same status as public road, as boundary with conveyances of fee going to the center. And so in generally, my experience in the rural areas, the deeds go to the section line or the center line of a road. Sometimes they're the same thing, right? And then when it becomes more urbanized, then there's some sort of road dedication where that goes to a public road to the city, and deeds changes, and it's usually some sort of subdivision act that then kind of is the trigger for that. And then there's some sort of map to retrace. It makes it a little bit easier to retrace there. So most of the Midwest states have statutory right-of-ways. Wisconsin has a lot of that. North Dakota had a lot of that. Iowa had a lot of that. But it's just the section lines have the statutory 66 foot, 33 on each side of the section line. And it's just given when that gets developed or road gets built, that there's this understanding that there is a public right of way, even though it's not a dedicated right of way yet, that on any section line, there's the possibility of a road coming through. And so that was just kind of a constant given there. Made surveying really great because if you found section corners, you know where you were going and going for that. And a lot of the fences were then just built kind of on those. It was really interesting in North Dakota. You could be out in the middle of nowhere and the fence would be 33 feet off the section line. You know, they didn't even build it on the section line. You just had all these fences that were 66 feet apart as you went through a lot of those areas in anticipation of some of that. And so you could, you know, it was kind of neat if you weren't familiar with it to be off by 33 feet of the section line for the first fence. Okay, let's go through some of these problems. It's been a few weeks here. January was kind of a weird one. I appreciate your guys' pivoting with me last week. But let's get some more involvement here and go through some of these problems. See if we remember this from the chapter here. Does a simple agreed boundary confer the adjoining lands the status of marketable title? You guys remember that from the very first part going through these chapters here? Anyone want to speak up and take a chance on that? Maybe if you don't even remember from the book, but thoughts on it? Does a simple agreed boundary confer the adjoining lands the status of marketable title? So what makes title marketable? What transfers the land? You need to have some sort of action, some sort of deed, and that is an agreement. But in my understanding, and again, I didn't go back through to answer these questions, you know, and review all the chapter, just the part that we wanted to cover today. But you know, there needs to be some sort of documentation of that. A handshake agreement on the back end does not convey it because it's not documented at the county. It doesn't make it marketable. It doesn't make it insurable. Written agreement, Aiden says. Teresa says perfecting the deed. Okay. Number 2, does a free line become a fixed? When does a free line become a fixed line? I guess we got to look at what free line means because I don't remember that in here. Anyone have a thought on that one? I don't remember free line in there. And I'm not sure how I'd answer that one. When does a free line become a fixed line? And probably with some sort of agreement as well, written agreement if it's you know, an ambiguity, I guess is what a free line is what he'd be talking about. So some sort of agreement to perfect and clean up that line. Is a relocated line more synonymous with a reestablished line or an agreement line? Thoughts, anybody?
I read this and I was kind of confused about what was there. For me, reestablishment means to find the original location of a monument and monument it in its original location. Relocation point, though, does not necessarily assume the location that an original monument was on, but where a monument was totally lost and can no longer be reliably put in its original location, then you may have to monument a corner based on equitable equity between the parties. This is the same type of thing that if you set a section corner that has been completely and irrevocably lost, you do it in a manner that gives equity to the other people that adjoin that corner. And the same thing is true on a subdivision. If you have a subdivision corner that's lost, then and maybe there is some difference there between what you find on the ground from the other corners and what's included on the survey plat or subdivision plat, then your relocation of a new monument to establish that corner has to be done by equity to the different parties. And that would be a relocated corner, not in its original case. So I know that doesn't harmonize real well with what Wattles said, but I don't know. That was the best I could get out of it.
No, I'm of the same mind as you, James. You know, we either do an original survey or a retracement survey, and Jeffrey Lucas talks about the third surveyor, right? The guy that comes in and he's not doing the retracement. He's just going to find his own. This is what I think it is, right? And doesn't respect the history of it. And so I agree with you. A relocated line is a line that is relocated. It's been moved because there was a need to do it, right? And that needs to be done by some agreement. But a reestablished line is you're finding where the line was, and if you didn't know where it was, it's the best evidence of where it was by some equitable action. Okay, is the grantee favored by a public grant? Is the grantee favored by a public grant?
No.
James says no. What are the two type of railroad deeds? And I wonder if he's talking about, because we didn't really read into this ton, he says there are generally two types of descriptions. One follows the form a strip of land, and the other reads a strip of land 100 feet wide, lying 50 feet on each side of the center line. The center of the tracks be laid. In the association, physical location control establishes the position of right-of-way, and the adjoiners need a survey to determine their physical measurements to and limits of boundary.
Well, when he said two types there, I thought of a railroad that's on fee simple land and a railroad that merely has an easement across the property.
Yeah, right there.
You know, so that's my two types.
Yeah, he doesn't. I don't see where he says deed, and so that's the one thing I'm wondering what he's talking about there when he says deed. He does talk about fee here, but I just wonder if he was talking about different types of descriptions of it. Sometimes for me, his questions don't quite line up with what his text was. Okay, what gives identification to lines? What gives identification to lines? Monument to the ground, physical evidence, fences called for. Okay, is a wall as a boundary called for in a deed as a condition subsequent sufficient to hold over a distance cited? Distance doesn't match a call to a wall. Which one holds?
Well, absolutely the wall, as long as it's the same wall that was described.
As long as it's the same wall that's described. Yep. Does a fence absolutely establish a boundary?
No.
No, I've had plenty of situations where the fence was placed at the bottom of a hill or a tree line out of convenience, and it was very clearly done that way. Occupation might look that, but as you dive more into it, it's very clear one side of the ditch or the other for access to gaining water. The fence does not absolutely establish a boundary. And then the last question, if there's ambiguity in the wording of a description, which factor will control? Application of the rules of construction or intent?
Intent.
Well, my take was the application of rules of construction was to help discover intent.
That might be true. But
They're just a
have to-
tool.
that's correct to identify the intent. The intent is the superior of all information. If you can identify that intent from the rules of construction or from any other information on the deed, might just be the fact that it's a warranty deed rather than a quitclaim deed might control the intent. You don't know where that's going to come from. But
Absolutely.
definitely the intent is the primary factor that you've got to go by.
I agree. That's what I was going to say is the rules of construction, the gathering of evidence, all of that comes into trying to determine what the intent of the parties was. And again, that applies when there is ambiguity in the intent, right? Like if you can't figure it out, then you've got to go through and gather more evidence and determine best as you can what the intent was by either the actions of the parties, the history on the ground, parole evidence, expert testimony, all these things we've been talking about, and rules of construction being one of those is, again, the question number 7, is a wall as a boundary called for in a deed as a condition of subsequent sufficient to hold over a distance cited? Well, if the deed says to go to a wall and that's the wall that you find and they're the same, it's pretty easy then to interpret the intent was to go to the wall over the distance because it's an easier thing to call for. And depending on the age of it, the measurement is more likely to have an error in there, right? And so you call to these bounds, call to a subdivision, call to an adjacent road, call to a railroad right away, whatever it is, or those are hard, fast calls. You might have to determine where they are, but those are clear indicators of intent over a distance, the hierarchy of the rules of construction. Okay. We didn't have much left on chapter 5, but I wanted to make sure we got through and finished it. Again, giving anyone else a chance to kind of look through, answer questions, make sure we've left this as clear as we can, and see if we need to just discuss anything else. Appreciate your guys' input. Okay, well, we're going to end probably just a little bit early then, but I guess we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, we did Tuesday the 19th.
Oh yeah, it's Tuesday. We're switching up to
Tuesday the
Tuesday because
20th.
we've got our UCLS conference that week, and I don't love you guys enough to leave that one. So I think there's probably a free dinner or something for me in that one, and so we'll do it on Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday the 20th.
Tuesday the 20th. Okay.
I'll shoot
Well,
it
thanks,
out.
guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Bye,
Have fun in
everyone.
North Carolina, Trent.
Thanks, sir. Bye,
See ya.
guys.